Aye, so this locomotive featured probably a couple of years ago in one of my early YouTubes. It's a Hornby Class 47, obviously. It's D1670 called Mammoth, and this is radio controlled. It's been radio controlled for quite some time, but I've now enhanced the functionality of it somewhat, and I'm just going to take you through that in this short video. So I've put the radio controller on, which you hopefully can see in a little window on the screen there. And to put the locomotive on, rather than footering with switches, I use a reed switch. And what's happened here is the locomotive has booted up. The processor in it is now running. You can see red lights at this end, and there are in fact red lights at the other end. When it sounds the horn to me, I sound a horn back from the remote control, and that's a handshake so that the processor knows that it is in radio communications. So as you would expect, if you drive a locomotive off, you have a red, and if you pause for a couple of seconds, you get reds at both ends, and then you get a white. So far so good. I'll just change a couple of points so I don't have a derailment. One of the issues with radio control, of course, is that despite there being isolation from the points, they wouldn't isolate because it's running under its own power. So I've paused for a couple of seconds and we're coming back, but if I was to stop and immediately go back, then it retains the existing cab configuration, being the cab at this end. I've now stopped for 2 seconds, and so it is reverting to driving from whichever cab the direction of a locomotive indicates. Now, there are other things that this can do as well. Obviously, in its simplest form, you have reds at the tail and white at the front. However, if you're pulling a train, you don't really want reds at the tail. So if we were to, for example, decide that we're going to couple up to coaches, we find a place I can do that. I'll be back to you in a minute. So we're going to couple up to, not very prototypical, these Coronation Scott coaches. So the locomotive advances towards coaches and stops, having coupled. We've now got red lights. However, we don't really want the red lights at this, which I believe is the number 2 end. So I'm going to refer to my chart, and I am going to toggle those lights off. There we go. And now if we were to drive the locomotive, we don't get any reds at the back, but we do have a white at the front, which I'll just following it round. You can see there are still no reds at the back, which is correct. So if we re-enable the lights at the number 2 end, we now have them. Another mode which I've read about is for shunting, where rather than changing the cab ends the whole time, a white and a red is shown at both ends of the locomotive, but typically the white wouldn't be the headlight. Now that's getting a bit complicated for this setup because I don't really have enough ports internally to drive different white lights and to control just 1 or 2 reds. So as a compromise, what I've done is illuminate the 2 reds at both ends and a dim headlight at each end. So let me just refer to my chart. So if I do a bind and a toggle up, you could just see there a dim white has come on for the headlight, and if we move down the track we have the same at the other end. Just by comparison, if we now come out of shunt mode and drive the locomotive, you can see the difference in the intensity of the white light. If I just put the lights down in the room, it also has cab lighting, which I think will come on if I do that. There we go. We've got number 1 end on at the moment, and it's set to come up in a kind of faded way. If you just watch it again, I'll just put them off. It goes down, up, and if we change direction, then the light changes to the other end of the cab. I didn't dwell long enough there for a cab switch. That's it now changed. So this time if I drive from the number 1 end, the cab lights change. Now we've got a few sounds as you would expect. Those are on the toggle. We can have a guard's whistle, and if we're moving slowly, say over some points which will not be open at the moment. Points are now open, so we'll move off and go over some points here. We could have some wheel squeal. I didn't get my use of the buttons timed absolutely perfectly there. It was still squealing a bit after the locomotive had stopped, but you probably get the idea. And we also have engine sounds, so if we start the engine, if we shut the engine down, it goes into a shutdown sequence, and if left without track power or any other radio comms, it'll actually switch the locomotive off. And there we go. There's also an enhanced startup sequence, which if I can get my button combinations right, I will try and do now. the engine is stationary, we're actually able to rev the engines themselves like this. And if I want to just simply shut the locomotive down without going through the shutdown procedure, if I was using it, for example, just to shunt things without any recognition of trying to be in any way realistic, double press of these buttons and she's gone.